In a shocking moment that stunned the entire cabin, Madison, the flight attendant, suddenly struck young Jaylen with a forceful punch to his arm, simply for helping an elderly passenger with her seatbelt. The tension in the air was electric as passengers gasped in disbelief. But what Madison didn't realize was that this troublesome boy she had just assaulted was actually the son of Captain Michael Roberts, the commanding pilot of their flight. When Captain Roberts' voice came over the intercom revealing this truth, Madison's face drained of all color as the weight of her actions came crashing down. The other passengers, who had witnessed her discriminatory behavior throughout the flight, now stared at her with looks of disgust and outrage. She had just physically attacked the son of the very person responsible for everyone's safety in the skies. But before we dive deeper into this powerful story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy hearing these important stories about standing up against discrimination, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our upcoming videos. Your support helps us continue sharing these meaningful messages that need to be heard. Join our community and let's make a difference together. The Miami International Airport was bustling with life, a hive of activity as passengers hurried through the terminal, eager to board their flights. The usual mix of excitement, tension, and the low hum of announcements echoed throughout the space. People were wrapped in their own worlds, some rushing to catch their connections, others chatting with friends or frantically checking their flight details. The air was thick with anticipation. This wasn't just any day at the airport. It was the day that Jaylen Roberts, a young boy with a heart full of dreams, was about to embark on his first solo flight. Jaylen's small figure stood out in the crowd, dressed neatly in his favorite aviation t-shirt, a soft smile tugging at his lips as he gazed around in awe. His hand tightly gripped the small backpack slung over his shoulder, and inside, tucked away carefully in its soft cloth, was a model plane, his good luck charm. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Today, at 10 years old, Jaylen was about to fly alone, a rite of passage that made him feel both nervous and incredibly proud. The flight wasn't just another trip, it was a connection to his father's world, a world that had fascinated him for as long as he could remember. Jaylen wasn't just a kid traveling for the first time, he was the son of Captain Michael Roberts, a respected pilot with years of experience soaring the skies. It was his father's voice over the intercom that would guide Jaylen's journey today. As Jaylen stood at the gates, the excitement was palpable, and his heart raced with the promise of adventure that lay ahead. Jaylen Roberts had been fascinated by aviation since he was old enough to understand what a plane was. His love for flying had ignited when he was just a toddler, watching his father slip into his uniform with that aura of calm confidence. Captain Michael Roberts was a legend in the world of aviation. His stories about the sky were always filled with awe and excitement, painting a picture of a world where the earth below seemed small and the clouds up above stretched endlessly. From the moment Jaylen could talk, he was captivated by every word his father spoke about aviation. "One day you'll be up there with me," Captain Roberts would say as they sat together, watching the planes take off and land at the local airport. Jaylen would always nod eagerly, imagining what it would be like to take control of a massive jet and glide above the world. As Jaylen grew older, his admiration for his father only deepened. Every time Captain Roberts came home from a flight, Jaylen would rush to greet him, his eyes wide with wonder as his father spoke of the places he had seen and the experiences he had had. But it wasn't just the excitement of travel or the technical side of aviation that drew Jaylen in. It was the sense of purpose and the responsibility that came with the job. Jaylen had a deep respect for his father. To him, Captain Roberts wasn't just a pilot, he was a hero. He embodied everything Jaylen aspired to be: strong, capable, and respected. He admired how his father effortlessly carried himself, from the way he wore his uniform with such pride, to the calm confidence in his voice when speaking to others. On weekends, Jaylen would sit in his father's study, flipping through old aviation magazines, learning about different aircraft, pilots, and the history of flight. Their home was filled with models of planes, some large, some small, each representing a moment in Jaylen's growing passion for aviation. He often spent hours arranging them on his desk, imagining himself at the controls, flying them through the skies. But it wasn't just the planes that connected father and son. It was the quiet moments they shared together. In the evenings, after a long day of work, Captain Roberts would sit with Jaylen on the back porch, both of them gazing up at the stars. They would talk about the future, and more often than not, those conversations would center around Jaylen's dream of becoming a pilot, just like his father. "Remember," Captain Roberts would say, his voice always steady and warm, "being a pilot isn't just about flying the plane. It's about taking care of everyone on board. You have to make sure they feel safe, respected, and valued." It was this philosophy that shaped Jaylen's worldview, and it was what he carried with him as he prepared for his first solo flight. Fathers and bond. The bond between Jaylen and his father was undeniable. It was a relationship built on shared experiences, trust, and respect. Jaylen admired his father not only for his professional accomplishments, but also for the way he treated people, whether they were fellow pilots, cabin crew, or the passengers he flew. Captain Roberts had a reputation for being both a brilliant pilot and an incredibly kind person. He never hesitated to help others, whether it was offering a reassuring word to a nervous passenger or staying late to guide a new co-pilot through their first flight. The first time Jaylen ever stepped into a cockpit, it was with his father. Jaylen was no older than 6, but he had been so eager to sit in the pilot's seat, Captain Roberts lifted him up and placed him gently in his lap. The cockpit was a wonderland of buttons, levers, and screens. Jaylen's eyes grew wide as his father explained the function of each control. He could still remember the hum of the engines and the rush of excitement as they took off, the sensation of flying for the first time filling him with a sense of awe that never really went away. As Jaylen grew older, his father took him on more trips. Sometimes Jaylen would even help out with small tasks, like holding the flight manual or adjusting the radio. It was during these trips that the foundation of Jaylen's future as a pilot was laid. Every conversation they had about aviation, every story his father shared, made Jaylen more determined to follow in his footsteps. At 10 years old, Jaylen wasn't quite ready to fly a plane, but he knew one thing for sure: he was destined for the skies. This flight, his first solo journey to New York, wasn't just a simple trip. It was a symbol of everything he had worked toward. Jaylen was an energetic, optimistic child with a deep curiosity about the world. His fascination with aviation wasn't limited to just planes. He was genuinely interested in how things worked, why they flew, and what made the sky so captivating. He was a child full of dreams, yet with a growing awareness that the world wasn't always as welcoming as he had hoped. He had a natural confidence in his passions, but there was still innocence in him. Jaylen believed in the good in people, in the fairness of the world, and in the idea that if he worked hard enough, his dreams would come true. He wasn't aware of the challenges he would face. He hadn't yet encountered the reality that sometimes people could be unfair based on nothing more than how they looked. Jaylen's first solo flight was the culmination of everything he had been working toward. As he stood in the airport, watching planes take off and feeling the weight of his father's teachings in his heart, he could only imagine the adventures that awaited him. This was the beginning of something big, something he would carry with him forever. But even as the excitement built, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty that he couldn't quite shake. In the airport, amidst the excitement of Jaylen's first solo flight, something was brewing that neither Jaylen nor the passengers could anticipate. Little did Jaylen know this trip, his first solo flight, would not only test his love for aviation, but would also challenge his understanding of the world. The conflict was about to unfold in ways he had never imagined. Jaylen walked through the crowded airport terminal, his eyes wide with excitement as he approached the gate for his flight to New York. He could barely contain himself, thinking of how his father would be piloting the plane he was about to board. He was finally going to see his grandmother, but more than that, he was flying solo for the first time. It was the kind of moment that felt magical to a young boy whose dreams were filled with skies and airplanes. As Jaylen stood in line at the gate, he spotted the flight attendant standing nearby, preparing for the boarding process. One of them, a woman in her 30s with straight brown hair neatly pulled back into a bun, was checking her clipboard with a focused look on her face. Her name tag read Madison. Jaylen took a deep breath and approached her, eager to start a friendly conversation. "Hey," Jaylen said brightly, standing a little straighter and tugging at the straps of his backpack. "I'm Jaylen. I'm flying to New York to see my grandma. My dad's the captain of the plane. He's flying it today." Madison glanced up at him briefly, her eyes narrowing slightly before quickly returning to the clipboard in her hands. Her lips parted for a second, but all she said was a quick, dismissive, "Go ahead and stand by the gate, please." Jaylen's heart sank a little. He had expected something warmer, maybe a smile or even a simple acknowledgement of his excitement, but Madison barely even looked at him, and certainly didn't seem interested in his father's role as the pilot. Feeling a bit deflated, Jaylen nodded and stepped back to wait for the boarding process to start. But he didn't let the encounter completely ruin his mood. He was still flying on the same plane as his dad. That thought kept him excited. He tried again, hoping to engage her in a more casual conversation. Jaylen shuffled up closer, clutching his boarding pass in one hand. "I think it's really cool my dad's the pilot. He's been flying for a long time, and I'm going to be a pilot too, just like him," he said, his voice bright, trying his best to share his enthusiasm. This time, Madison's response came without even looking at him. She didn't stop moving her hands over the papers she was sorting through. "That's nice," she muttered, her tone as cold as the air conditioning blasting through the terminal. "Now, please just wait by the line." Jaylen's chest tightened with confusion, but he didn't want to press it. He had tried to make a connection, but it felt like Madison wasn't even considering him as a person. It was as if he was just another piece of luggage to be handled, another unaccompanied minor on the list. He watched as she went about her duties, her face set in a cold, professional mask. As she gestured for him to stand aside and wait for boarding to start, he felt the weight of her indifference settle on him, making him feel smaller than he had when he first arrived at the gate. The other passengers milled around the terminal, some glancing over at Jaylen with a polite smile, but no one seemed to notice the icy reception he had just received from the flight attendant. He felt like he was the only one who had experienced it, and it was only him who could feel the sting of Madison's sharp tone, which, while not overtly rude, was enough to make Jaylen shrink back. Madison's professionalism was evident in her movements, but her detachment was palpable. She wasn't rude in a typical way. She didn't snap at him or raise her voice. She simply ignored him, brushed him off, and made him feel invisible. Jaylen was accustomed to receiving a certain amount of kindness from adults, especially when he was excited about something as big as flying, but Madison's coldness made him feel like he was insignificant, just another task she had to check off before getting to the next one. Jaylen shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling creeping up on him. He'd never had anyone make him feel this way before, especially not someone who was supposed to make him feel welcome on the plane. As the seconds ticked by, Jaylen began to question himself. Was it his age? Was it the way he looked? Or was it because she didn't believe him when he said his dad was the pilot? He couldn't understand why someone would treat him like this, especially when all he wanted to do was share a bit of his excitement. Madison didn't seem to notice or care. She moved past him toward another passenger without even so much as glancing his way. The contrast between how she handled the other passengers and how she treated Jaylen couldn't have been more stark. It was as if his excitement meant nothing to her, as if his very presence was something to be tolerated, not celebrated. It was then that Jaylen realized he was just a kid to her, and in her eyes, kids didn't matter. It was as if his dreams and his connection to the flight were as insignificant as the boarding pass he held in his hand. Feeling embarrassed and unsure, Jaylen pulled his shoulders back and turned away, trying his best to hide his disappointment. He wasn't going to let this ruin his flight. He still had so much to look forward to. His first solo journey, his father piloting the plane, the adventure that awaited him in New York. But in that moment, he couldn't shake the coldness Madison had shown him. It stung more than he cared to admit. As Jaylen stood by the gate, waiting for the boarding process to begin, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Madison, the flight attendant, who had barely acknowledged him earlier, was now moving through the terminal with another colleague, her voice barely audible but sharp enough for Jaylen to catch the edge of her words. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop, he was simply standing in the designated area, glancing around with quiet anticipation, but as Madison and her colleague passed by, Their conversation took a turn that cut through the background noise of the airport. "Unaccompanied minors are always the worst," Madison said, her tone heavy with irritation. "They come in all entitled, like they're special just because their parents have money or some big job. You can tell that kid was just using his dad's job to get attention, probably hoping for some sort of special treatment." Jaylen froze. The words hit him like a punch to the chest. His heart thudded painfully in his ears as he processed what Madison had just said. She was talking about him. He hadn't meant to overhear, but the words were unmistakable, clear as day. Entitled and using his dad's job felt like sharp barbs aimed directly at his pride. His dad, Captain Michael Roberts, wasn't just some figure to flaunt around. He was someone Jaylen admired with all his heart. His father wasn't a big job or a status symbol. He was a dedicated, respected pilot, and to hear Madison reduce him to a mere tool for attention made Jaylen's stomach churn with anger. He tried to convince himself it was nothing. Maybe Madison hadn't meant it the way it sounded. Maybe she was just venting about the stress of the job. But then she spoke again, this time with an undercurrent of venom that was unmistakable. "And they always act like they're the only ones flying. Kids these days, thinking the world revolves around them. I'm telling you, it's always the ones with the most privilege that make the biggest scene." Jaylen's chest tightened, the hurt that surged through him making it hard to breathe. He blinked hard, trying to make sense of the situation, trying to understand why Madison was so focused on him. He wasn't the one who had been difficult, and he certainly wasn't the one causing a scene. He was just a kid traveling to see his grandmother, thrilled at the thought of flying on the same plane as his father. So why was he being labeled as someone entitled? Why was she making assumptions about him, about his life, about his father, about who he was, just because of the way he looked? Jaylen glanced around the terminal, suddenly feeling small, invisible, and hyper-aware of everything. The familiar feeling of excitement he'd had just moments before was replaced with a sharp, icy feeling of isolation. He felt his throat tighten, his body tense, and his head began to buzz with confusion. For the first time, he began to question the very thing he had always loved. The aviation world that he had once viewed as a place of endless possibilities now seemed cold and unwelcoming. His father's job, once a source of pride, now felt like a burden in the eyes of someone he didn't even know. Jaylen had always looked up to pilots, heroes in uniform, but hearing Madison's words made him wonder if he truly belonged in that world at all. Was he simply a product of privilege, an annoying child looking for attention, or worse, was the world of aviation his dream, really built on systems that excluded him based on how he looked? Jaylen swallowed hard, forcing back the lump that had formed in his throat. The words seemed to echo in his mind, swirling around, each repetition cutting deeper. The pain of Madison's judgment, delivered casually as if it were just another complaint, felt more like a betrayal than anything else. It wasn't the kind of treatment he had ever expected. His father had taught him that the sky was for everyone. No one was excluded from that dream, but now, for the first time, Jaylen was seeing the ugly side of that world, and it hurt more than he could express. Jaylen didn't know what to do. His hands were shaking, and for a brief moment he thought about walking away, leaving the gate entirely. But that wasn't the answer. His father had always told him to stand tall in the face of adversity, to not let the opinions of others define him. But now, in the silence of the terminal, surrounded by the hum of the airport and the distant chatter of other passengers, Jaylen didn't know who he was anymore. The world he loved, the world his father was a part of, now seemed out of reach, tainted by this first taste of real exclusion. He wanted to shout, to say something to Madison, to make her understand that she was wrong, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he felt the weight of his father's lessons, the ones that had been ingrained in him for years. The world is full of people who will try to define you by things you can't control. It's how you respond to them that matters. You control who you become. But Jaylen was struggling to understand how he could respond to something that felt so unfair, something so personal. It wasn't just a matter of standing up for himself, it was about trying to understand why someone would treat him this way simply because of his skin color. Madison didn't know him. She didn't know his family. She had no idea the years he'd spent dreaming of this day, the hours he'd spent studying the sky. And yet she assumed the worst about him based on a few seconds of interaction. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't about him being an unaccompanied minor. This wasn't even about the small, silly things like sitting in the right seat or following rules. It was about something deeper. It was about racism, the subtle but powerful ways people made assumptions based on the color of his skin. Madison's comments weren't just a critique of his behavior, they were a judgment on his very existence. Jaylen's thoughts spun out of control. He didn't know how to fix this. How could he change what had been said? How could he prove to her and to the world that he wasn't just another entitled kid, a stereotype that others would expect him to live up to? It felt like a mountain that was too steep to climb, too high to reach. But then a small voice inside him pushed through the chaos of his thoughts. It was his father's voice, the one that had always guided him, the one that had taught him about respect, kindness, and strength. "Keep your head up," his father would always say. "You're a part of something bigger, something special. Don't let anyone make you feel small." Jaylen clenched his fists and took a deep breath, his chest rising with the air filling his lungs. He wasn't going to let Madison's words define him. He wasn't going to let this one encounter with someone who didn't understand the value of kindness dictate how he saw himself. He was more than what she saw. He was more than the assumptions she had made. But deep down, a part of him wondered just how many other people in this world would see him the way Madison had. How many others would judge him before even giving him a chance. And that thought, more than anything else, made Jaylen feel like his journey was just beginning. It wasn't just about flying today. It was about learning to rise above the hurt and make the world better, one small step at a time. Jaylen trudged down the aisle of the plane, his small feet dragging behind him as he reluctantly followed Madison to the seat she had assigned him. The excitement that had been bubbling inside him only hours earlier now felt like a distant memory. Instead of the spacious seat by the window he had hoped for, just like his father always sat in, Madison directed him toward the back of the plane, where the seats were cramped, tucked away near the narrow aisle by the left. The space was smaller than Jaylen had anticipated, and the smells from the bathroom seemed to linger in the air, adding to the discomfort of the already tight seat. The small window that Jaylen had dreamed of gazing out of during takeoff was blocked by a wing of the plane, barely offering a sliver of the sky. He placed his backpack on the floor, trying to make himself comfortable, but it felt impossible. The back of the plane was loud, filled with the constant noise of the overhead compartments and the clicking of the laboratory doors as passengers moved in and out. As he settled into his seat, Jaylen couldn't shake the feeling of being small and insignificant. He thought back to the conversations he had imagined sharing with the flight attendants, the friendly exchanges he'd dreamed of while waiting at the gate. But now, it seemed like that dream was shattered. No one spoke to him here, except for Madison, who had been nothing but cold. She had barely even noticed when she had given him the wrong seat assignment, just another check on her list of passengers to manage. Jaylen's chest tightened as he tried to focus on the view outside the window, but the reality of his situation made it hard to concentrate. The plane's engines roared to life and the aircraft began to taxi toward the runway. The usual excitement that came with this moment, the thrill of soaring through the clouds, of experiencing something his father did every day, felt muted now. The pride he had felt at the start of the day was beginning to fade, replaced with a gnawing discomfort. He thought about what Madison had said earlier. Entitled kids and privileged passengers. The words kept echoing in his mind, and as much as he tried to push them away, they lingered. Was that how people saw him? He had never thought of himself as entitled, just a kid excited about flying, about the world his father had introduced him to. But now, everything had changed. He wasn't just an excited child on a plane. He was a young black boy sitting in a seat that was too small for him, overlooked, and treated like a nuisance. It didn't feel like the adventure he had imagined. It felt like a battle, a fight he didn't want to be in but found himself caught up in nonetheless. As the plane ascended into the sky, Jaylen tried to focus on the feeling of liftoff, the same feeling his father had always described when they talked about the beauty of flying. But the emotional weight of everything that had happened since boarding started to drown out that sense of wonder. He squeezed his eyes shut and thought about his father's words. "Keep your head up, son. You're a part of this team, just like me." It was the same advice his father had given him when he had faced challenges before, and he repeated it to himself now like a mantra. "Keep your head up. Keep your head up." But the words, comforting as they were, couldn't erase the sting of the situation. He tried to stay positive. He reminded himself that he was going to see his grandmother in New York, and he reminded himself of his dad waiting for him at the controls, guiding the plane with calm authority. Jaylen thought about his father sitting in the cockpit, doing what he loved. He thought about how proud he'd been earlier that day to tell everyone that his dad was the captain of the flight, but now it felt hollow. He felt disconnected from his own dream. The world he had always seen as welcoming and full of promise now seemed closed off and uninviting. It wasn't just the physical discomfort of the seat that hurt. It was the emotional weight of the rejection. He wasn't being treated like the future pilot he aspired to be. He wasn't even being treated like a person with his own dreams. He was just another black boy on a plane, a nuisance to some and nothing more. Jaylen glanced around, hoping to catch the eye of someone who might offer him a bit of kindness. But everyone seemed wrapped up in their own worlds, lost in their books or plugged into their devices. No one noticed him, and that was a painful realization. It wasn't like he expected the attention. He just wanted to be treated like everyone else, with dignity and respect. As the plane cruised, the hours stretched on and Jaylen's mind wandered. The confusion of the morning, the brief but cutting words of Madison, the isolation of being treated as less than, everything weighed on him. He had come into this flight full of excitement, thinking of all the places he'd go one day as a pilot. He had imagined that flying was a place of connection, where everyone could share a common goal, a shared experience. But now he felt like an outsider, trapped in his seat with only his thoughts for company. Every time he looked out the window, he saw only clouds and sky, endless and vast. But to him, the view felt disconnected from the dream he once had. It was as if the world, the very thing that had once felt so full of possibility, was now out of reach. Jaylen tried again to focus, clinging to his father's words. "You're a part of this team," but it didn't feel like he was. He felt more like a spectator in his own journey, stuck in the back of the plane with a world of opportunity just beyond his reach. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about the way he felt treated, the way his dreams were starting to feel like something he couldn't access. But deep down, despite the hurt, Jaylen knew something important. This wasn't the end. He would rise above this. He wasn't going to let one cold encounter, one dismissive comment, define who he was or who he would become. He may have been small in the world of aviation for now, but he knew that one day he'd be in the cockpit, making the decisions, leading others. This was just a bump in the road. Still, as the plane continued its journey through the sky, Jaylen's eyes drifted back to the wing and the clouds outside. He clung to that quiet resolve, knowing that the fight for respect and belonging was just beginning. Jaylen sat quietly in his cramped seat, trying to block out the hum of the plane and focus on the task ahead. The discomfort of being stuck near the bathroom, the words of Madison echoing in his mind, and the overwhelming sense of alienation weighed heavily on him. But just when he thought he might escape into a moment of calm, something happened that would turn the entire flight upside down. A few rows ahead, an elderly woman sitting near the aisle was struggling to fasten her seatbelt. Her hands were shaking, and despite her best efforts, she couldn't seem to get the clasp to click into place. She glanced around helplessly, her face contorted in frustration. Jaylen watched her for a moment, and something in him clicked. It wasn't just the discomfort of his seat or the unfairness of the way he was being treated. It was the compassion his father had always shown to others, the same compassion Jaylen had always been taught to practice. Without thinking, Jaylen unbuckled his own seatbelt and slid out of his seat, moving quietly down the aisle. He was determined to help the elderly woman, to show the kindness his father would have shown even if no one else seemed to care. "Excuse me, ma'am," Jaylen said gently, tapping her on the shoulder. "Do you need help with your seatbelt?" The elderly woman looked up at him, her eyes lighting up with relief. "Oh dear, yes. My hands aren't as steady as they used to be. Could you help me with this?" Jaylen nodded, smiling warmly as he knelt down and began to help her with the seatbelt. He carefully guided her hands, making sure she was secure. It was a simple act, but for the elderly woman, it was the difference between struggling alone and receiving a moment of kindness. But as Jaylen was finishing the task, he suddenly felt a harsh voice behind him. "What do you think you're doing, young man?" Madison's voice cut through the air, sharp and cold. "Get back to your seat right now." Jaylen straightened up, surprised by the sudden command. He turned to face Madison, who stood with her arms crossed, her expression stern. "You need to sit back down. We have rules for a reason. You're not the one who should be helping passengers," she snapped. "You're just a kid. You're trying to do everything." Jaylen blinked, momentarily stunned by her words. He hadn't meant to cause any trouble. He'd simply wanted to help. He opened his mouth to explain, but before he could say anything, Madison's voice became even more biting. "Sit down, now." He hesitated, his confusion growing. The elderly woman was still sitting there, smiling at him gratefully, but Madison's aggressive tone didn't leave room for him to argue. With a sinking feeling in his chest, Jaylen nodded, backing away from the elderly woman's seat and moving back toward his own. As he made his way back to the cramped seat, his eyes caught Madison's, and in that moment she did something Jaylen never expected. She raised her hand and, with a swift, angry motion, punched him on the arm. The strike was hard, shocking, and completely uncalled for. Jaylen's body jolted with the force of the punch, and he instinctively flinched, unable to stop himself. The pain surged through his arm, radiating from the spot where her fist had made contact. He was momentarily stunned, blinking in disbelief. For a second, everything seemed to blur as he struggled to process what had just happened. The entire cabin seemed to fall into a heavy silence, a stunned hush hanging in the air. The passengers around him shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. Jaylen stood frozen in place, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to make sense of what had just transpired. Madison stood there, her posture rigid and defiant, not a flicker of regret on her face. Her eyes were cold, distant, as if she had done nothing wrong. She was ready to move on, but the rest of the passengers weren't as willing to let the situation slide so easily. It was the elderly woman who first broke the silence, her voice trembling but full of quiet indignation. "Did she just hit that boy?" she asked, turning toward the passenger beside her. Jaylen's face flushed red with a mix of pain and humiliation. He didn't know how to respond. His arm still throbbed from the punch, and his heart ached as he tried to hold back tears. He hadn't expected any of this, least of all from someone who was supposed to make him feel safe and cared for on the plane. The businessman across the aisle leaned forward, a look of disbelief spreading across his face. "That's not right," he muttered, his voice low but tinged with anger. He glanced toward Madison, then at the other passengers who were now taking notice of what had happened. A few rose up. A young mother with her toddler on her lap shook her head in disbelief. "Did you see that?" she whispered to her husband, her voice filled with quiet fury. "That poor boy, he was just trying to help." The growing sense of discomfort in the cabin was palpable now. Passengers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others whispering quietly amongst themselves. A businessman sitting across the aisle leaned forward, his face hard with disapproval. "You don't treat a child like that, especially not one who's doing something kind," he muttered under his breath. "There's no reason for that." Jaylen, still reeling from the punch, glanced around the cabin. The realization hit him like a wave. He wasn't the only one who had seen what had happened. Other people were noticing, and they weren't staying silent. He could feel the tension building in the air as the passengers started to collectively come to his defense. The atmosphere shifted. What had been a quiet, routine flight was now charged with an energy of disbelief and outrage. Madison, for her part, seemed unaware of the growing storm she had created. She moved down the aisle, continuing her duties, but the tension in the air clung to her every step. Passengers continued to whisper, casting angry glances in her direction. It wasn't just the punch that hurt. It was the fact that no one had stood up for Jaylen in that moment. He was a child, vulnerable and trying to do the right thing, and yet he had been met with aggression and scorn. But as the passengers around him began to murmur in disapproval, Jaylen realized something important. He wasn't alone. For the first time during the flight, he felt like he had allies, people who saw the injustice and were willing to call it out. It wasn't the way he had wanted to fight his battles, but in that moment, Jaylen felt something shift inside him. He wasn't invisible. His voice mattered, and as the murmurs grew louder, he found strength in knowing that the wrongs could be righted, even if it took others standing up for him. But Madison wasn't done yet, and Jaylen knew that this was only the beginning of the struggle that lay ahead. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere on the plane grew heavier, like a storm that was slowly but surely brewing. Jaylen sat in his seat, still reeling from Madison's punch. His arm ached, but it was the emotional sting that hurt the most. He couldn't believe what had just happened, and the humiliation seemed to pulse through his chest with each breath. His mind kept replaying Madison's coldness, her dismissiveness, her anger, and now her unprovoked aggression. But what Jaylen didn't expect, in that moment of isolation and hurt, was the wave of support that was about to come his way. It started quietly at first. The elderly woman, Helen, who Jaylen had helped with her seatbelt, was sitting a few rows ahead of him. Her face, once calm and composed, now showed a quiet fury. She had witnessed the entire exchange between Jaylen and Madison. The punch, the dismissive words. It was impossible for her to ignore, and it was clear that she wasn't going to let it slide. With a deep breath, Helen pushed her seat back and stood up slowly, using her cane for support. She glanced around, making sure the other passengers were following her lead, and then turned toward Madison, who was walking back down the aisle, still unaware of the tension she had sparked. "Excuse me, miss," Helen called out, her voice strong but calm. Madison stopped and turned, a slight frown creasing her forehead as she met the elderly woman's gaze. "Yes," Madison responded with her usual professional detachment. Helen's eyes locked onto hers. "I just wanted to say," she began, her voice unwavering, "that what you did to that young boy was completely unacceptable." Madison's eyes flickered with surprise, but she didn't say anything. She simply stood there, a forced smile tugging at her lips, as if this was an inconvenient interruption to her day. "I saw you treat him like he was invisible," Helen continued, her voice growing firmer. "You ignored him when he was trying to do something kind. You dismissed him as if he didn't matter. And then, when he tried to help someone else, you hit him. You hit a child." There was a pause, and the silence that followed seemed to envelop the entire cabin. The passengers around them had begun to notice the exchange. Some had stopped reading their books or staring out the windows, eyes shifting between Helen and Madison. The elderly woman's words hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. For a moment, no one moved, but then another voice spoke up. Mr. Green, the businessman seated across the aisle from Jaylen, leaned forward. His suit was impeccably pressed, his expression firm but not hostile. "I agree with her," he said, his voice resonating with authority. "That young boy was only trying to help, and you treated him with nothing but contempt. What kind of example are you setting for the rest of us?" Madison's face twisted slightly, her eyes narrowing, but she didn't respond. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable, as if she wasn't prepared for this public confrontation. Her usual calm was slipping, replaced by defensiveness, and it was obvious that the growing number of voices in the cabin was starting to make her uneasy. But the passengers weren't done. A quiet murmur spread throughout the rows, and more people began to speak up. The young mother with the toddler, who had been watching the interaction with concern, turned to her husband, her voice soft but full of outrage. "She treated him like he was a problem," she said, glancing back at Madison. "All he wanted to do was help. He didn't deserve that." The businessman, Mr. Green, nodded in agreement. "It's beyond unprofessional," he added, his voice tinged with disbelief. "This isn't just a minor mistake. You humiliated a child." Jaylen sat in his seat, his heart pounding as he listened to the growing chorus of support for him. For the first time since the incident, he felt a spark of hope. The voices around him weren't just murmurs. They were rising in solidarity, amplifying each other's words. Helen, who had started this wave of support, turned to Madison once again, her expression no longer one of mere disapproval but of deep disappointment. "We expect better from people in positions like yours," she said, her tone unwavering. "We trust flight attendants to make us feel safe and welcome, not to make us feel small, and you've failed in that." Madison's eyes flickered with a moment of uncertainty. She seemed to shrink under the weight of the criticism. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. The passengers were no longer silent. More people were nodding, murmuring in agreement, and glancing toward Madison with expressions that ranged from disapproval to outright anger. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and the pressure was building. The young mother, whose toddler was now asleep in her lap, leaned over to the man sitting next to her. "He's just a boy," she said softly, her voice filled with empathy. "He didn't deserve any of that. I can't believe she actually hit him." Jaylen, still sitting in his cramped seat, stared down at his lap, feeling a rush of mixed emotions. He had expected to endure this flight quietly, to get to his grandmother's house without any issues. But now, everything had changed. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all the passengers around him coming together to challenge what had happened. They were speaking up for what was right, and that made Jaylen feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: empowered. The murmurs grew louder, and Jaylen could hear the shift in the atmosphere. Madison was now standing near the galley, her posture stiff and uncomfortable. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her. The realization was slowly sinking in that she wasn't in control of the situation anymore. The passengers had united, and they weren't going to let this injustice pass without addressing it. Some passengers exchanged looks, silently making decisions. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief, still processing what they had witnessed. The shift in power was palpable. Madison had become the target of collective frustration, and the quiet strength of the passengers around Jaylen had created a ripple effect. What had started as a singular act of cruelty had turned into a moment of unity and resistance. For Jaylen, it was overwhelming. He had spent most of the flight feeling alone, isolated in the back of the plane, but now he felt a powerful sense of community. The tension was still thick in the air, but there was something else too, something more positive. He wasn't alone anymore. The ripple of solidarity didn't just fill the cabin with tension, it filled it with the promise of change. A change that was being fueled by the collective voice of the passengers standing up for what was right. The storm wasn't over yet, but it was clear that Madison was beginning to realize she couldn't silence it. Not this time. Jaylen knew in that moment that no matter how this confrontation ended, it had already changed everything for him. He wasn't invisible anymore, and he wasn't alone. Madison stood near the galley, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, trying to maintain an air of authority despite the growing tension in the cabin. The passengers' disapproval was palpable, but she refused to back down. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself as murmurs of frustration and disbelief echoed through the rows. "I don't understand what the big deal is," she said, her voice rising slightly in frustration. "I was just enforcing the rules. He's an unaccompanied minor. I wasn't about to let him disrupt the flight by getting involved in other passengers' business." Her words hung in the air, but instead of softening the atmosphere, they only added fuel to the fire. The passengers around her exchanged incredulous looks, the disbelief growing with each word that came from Madison's mouth. "Disrupting the flight?" Mr. Green, the businessman from earlier, asked, his voice thick with incredulity. "He was trying to help an elderly passenger, for crying out loud. What's wrong with that?" Madison's face flushed with irritation, but she held her ground. "I don't see the issue," she insisted, her tone defensive. "There are rules, and I have to follow them. It's my job." "But hitting a child?" a woman from the front row called out, her voice laced with anger. "That's not enforcing rules. That's abusing your position." Jaylen, still sitting in his cramped seat, could feel the weight of the moment. He had hoped for some resolution, perhaps a simple apology or a recognition of wrongdoing, but Madison was only digging in deeper. The weight of the emotional tension in the cabin made his chest tighten. The growing chorus of voices against Madison only made him feel smaller, more exposed. Madison refused to acknowledge the impact of her actions. "Look, I did what I had to do," she said, her voice now tinged with a hint of desperation. "I'm just trying to do my job. I'm not the one at fault here." The atmosphere in the cabin was now thick with an undercurrent of outrage. The passengers, once passive and absorbed in their own thoughts, were united in their discontent. Their frustration simmered, and the heat of the moment felt like it could spill over at any second. Jaylen's head was spinning. He couldn't understand how someone could be so blind to the harm they caused. To Madison, her actions seemed justified, as if she could wash her hands of the situation by simply clinging to the notion of rules. But to Jaylen and to the growing group of passengers, it was clear that this wasn't about rules. It was about decency, respect, and human kindness. Despite everything, Madison seemed determined to stand firm in her refusal to apologize, and as the passengers' anger rose, the emotional pressure in the cabin only intensified. The tension in the cabin had reached a boiling point. The passengers were growing louder now, their voices rising with disbelief and frustration as Madison continued to stubbornly defend her actions. She had just punched a child, an innocent, helpful boy, and instead of acknowledging the gravity of the situation, she clung to the notion that she was merely enforcing rules. Her words felt like fuel on a fire, and the heat in the cabin was suffocating. Jaylen sat quietly in his seat, his fingers clenched around the armrest, trying to ignore the chaos around him. He had never expected any of this. His excitement about the flight, the pride he had felt about flying with his dad had all been stripped away. What he was left with was confusion, pain, and a deep sense of isolation. The anger from the passengers was there, but it was still too distant from him. Madison's dismissive words had hurt, but it was the punch, the unjustified aggression that had left a lasting mark on his soul. He never imagined the world of aviation, the world he'd dreamed about for so long, could be so cold, so unwelcoming. And then, just as the weight of the situation seemed unbearable, the loudspeaker crackled to life. The voice that followed cut through the tension like a knife. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," came the voice of Captain Michael Roberts. There was a calm authority to his tone, the kind that filled the cabin with a sense of reassurance that only a seasoned pilot could deliver. "I understand there's been some tension aboard the flight today, and I'd like to address it." Jaylen's heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice. It was his father. A small wave of relief washed over him, but it was quickly overshadowed by the sinking feeling in his stomach. Captain Michael had always been the voice of calm in Jaylen's life. But now, hearing his father speak over the intercom, Jaylen wasn't sure whether the revelation would be comforting or devastating. There was a slight pause before Captain Roberts continued, his voice now laced with the unmistakable pride and warmth Jaylen knew so well. "I want to let you all know that the young boy seated in the back, the one who tried to assist an elderly passenger, is not just any passenger," Captain Roberts said, his words steady and commanding. "That boy is my son, Jaylen Roberts. He's not just the son of a pilot, he's a future pilot himself, and he has been flying with me since he was a child. His dreams are as big as the sky itself." Jaylen felt his heart leap in his chest. A sense of pride surged through him, but the words also felt like a weight. This wasn't just about a father speaking with pride about his son. It was about revealing a truth that had been hidden up until this point. The world around him shifted as the passengers began to process the announcement. Captain Roberts continued, his voice growing firmer. "Jaylen has always been taught to treat others with kindness, respect, and integrity. I expect that same treatment for him, and for anyone aboard this flight. We all share this sky, and in this cabin, every single person deserves dignity and respect. No one is above anyone else." Jaylen's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know how to process what was happening. His father had just revealed the truth about who he was, and now everyone aboard the plane knew that the young boy they'd seen treated with disdain was no ordinary passenger. He was the son of the captain, the very person who was responsible for their safety and well-being in the skies. But as Jaylen sat there, his emotions swirling, the real effect of Captain Roberts' announcement began to unfold. Madison, who had been standing near the galley with her arms folded, her posture defensive and stubborn, went rigid. her face drained of color as the weight of the words hit her like a ton of bricks. Her gaze shifted from the passengers to Jaylen, and in that instant the truth seemed to slam into her all at once. Jaylen wasn't just a random child she had decided to push around. He wasn't just another entitled minor who was causing trouble. He was the son of the very person who commanded the flight, the same man who held the lives of every passenger in his hands. Madison's eyes widened in disbelief as her mind struggled to process the revelation. She looked at Jaylen, who was now sitting quietly in his seat, his eyes downcast but filled with an unspoken weight that Madison could no longer ignore. The realization crashed over her. She had treated the son of the captain with the kind of coldness and aggression that she would never have dared to show a child of any other passenger. She had humiliated him, dismissed him, and worst of all, she had struck him. For the first time, Madison began to feel the full weight of her actions. It wasn't just that she had wronged Jaylen. It was the fact that, in her arrogance, she had allowed her own biases, her assumptions based on his age and skin color, to dictate her behavior. She had acted out of a place of unconscious prejudice, blind to the humanity of the child in front of her. The guilt hit her like a wave, her cheeks flushing with shame. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She glanced at Jaylen again, his quiet presence in the back of the plane now a sharp contrast to her own aggression. She wanted to apologize, to explain herself, but she knew that there was no excuse for what she had done. The other passengers, who had been silently absorbing Captain Roberts' words, now turned their attention to Madison. They watched her as she stood there, motionless, her eyes flickering with a mix of guilt, anger, and shame. The shift in the power dynamic was palpable. The passengers, who had once been passive observers of the situation, now held the power to either condone or condemn her actions. The silence that followed Captain Roberts' announcement was deafening. It wasn't an angry silence, it was a contemplative one, where the weight of what had just been revealed hung heavy in the air. It was clear now that Madison's actions had not only been a personal failure, but also a moral one. She had allowed her own bias to taint the way she treated a young boy, someone who was now revealed to be the son of the man who had been responsible for this entire flight. Madison's hands trembled slightly as she looked at the passengers around her. She could feel their eyes on her, not with curiosity, but with disapproval. The passengers were no longer just upset with her, they were disappointed. And that disappointment felt far worse than any anger could have. Jaylen sat in his seat, his heart still racing. He had heard the announcement. He had felt the tension shift in the cabin, the realization spreading like wildfire, but in that moment, he didn't want to be the center of attention. He didn't want to focus on the guilt that was now written all over Madison's face. He just wanted to move past this moment and let the flight continue. His father's voice had brought the situation to a head, but it was now up to the passengers and to Madison to decide how this moment would end. Madison's internal struggle was now clear for all to see, and it was impossible for her to undo what had already been done. But the passengers, whose discontent had grown throughout the flight, had made their voices heard. And as the tension in the cabin finally began to dissipate, one thing was clear. This moment had shifted something deeper in the atmosphere of the flight. Something that could no longer be ignored. The truth had come to light, and with it, a change was brewing in the hearts of those who had witnessed this painful confrontation. Jaylen sat still in his seat, the vibrations of the plane seeming to pulse through his chest. He had always been the quiet observer, watching others, taking in the world with wide eyes. But something had changed in him after his father's announcement. The shock of what had transpired, the pain of the mistreatment he had suffered, was slowly being replaced by a sense of quiet strength. It was as though the weight of the situation had shifted something deep inside him. His heart no longer felt heavy with confusion and hurt. Instead, it was filled with something else, something more powerful. Empowerment. He glanced around the cabin, seeing the passengers' eyes now trained on him, many with expressions of sympathy, but others with a new determination. He realized for the first time that he wasn't alone. The discontent had been palpable throughout the flight, but now, in the wake of his father's words, something different had taken root. The passengers, once passive, had united in their support. They weren't just standing up for a child, they were standing up for what was right. Jaylen took a deep breath, feeling his small body fill with something he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the power of the passengers rallying around him, it was the knowledge that the world had just seen him. Not as a child who could be dismissed, not as someone easily overlooked, but as a person who mattered. He had a voice, and his voice had been heard. And it was in that moment that Jaylen understood the true power of solidarity. He no longer felt like an outsider. His father's announcement had opened the floodgates, and the passengers were now rising to meet him. Each look they gave him, each nod of understanding strengthened him. His once isolated position in the back of the plane now felt different. It felt significant. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically. What had been a flight filled with tension and confusion was now a flight marked by unity. Madison, standing near the galley, was still reeling from the weight of the announcement. Her face had lost the confident, authoritative expression she had once worn so easily. Instead, her gaze flickered nervously between Jaylen and the other passengers, who had begun to make their discomfort with her actions clear. It wasn't just a handful of voices now. The collective discontent of the cabin was a powerful force that couldn't be ignored. The passengers were no longer whispering in hushed tones. They were speaking with purpose. A man seated a few rows ahead of Jaylen, one of the first to stand up in solidarity, leaned toward the flight attendant in front of him, his voice low but steady. "I've been flying for years," he said, his tone calm but firm, "and I've never seen a child treated like that. You've made a mistake and you need to own it." A ripple of agreement ran through the rows. People were no longer afraid to speak out. Jaylen could hear the murmurs, voices rising with a quiet but undeniable force. "She shouldn't have treated him like that," one woman said. "He was just helping an elderly passenger." Jaylen watched as another voice joined in. A middle-aged man, his face creased with the lines of age and wisdom, nodded firmly in agreement. "That boy has every right to be treated with respect. He's the son of the captain. He deserves kindness, not a punch. We're all passengers here, and we all deserve dignity." The growing chorus of support sent a shiver down Jaylen's spine. He had never felt like this before. It was a humbling feeling knowing that these people, who had started as strangers, were now standing together for him. The sense of empowerment that had filled him only moments ago now felt real, palpable, and undeniable. He wasn't fighting alone. His father had given him the strength to rise, and now the passengers had given him the courage to speak his truth without words. But it wasn't just the words of the passengers that had made the difference. It was the quiet, unspoken understanding that passed between them. It was the knowing looks, the nods, and the collective action. Each small act of solidarity built upon the other, creating a force so powerful that Madison couldn't ignore it. The emotional pressure in the cabin had reached a boiling point, and there was no turning back now. Madison shifted uncomfortably on her feet, her posture tense as the eyes of the entire cabin seemed to converge on her. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the words didn't come. The usual confidence she had exuded earlier, the cold professionalism that had once shielded her from accountability, now seemed to falter under the weight of the collective voices that had risen against her. A few rows away, another passenger, a woman with short cropped hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, crossed her arms over her chest and spoke directly to Madison. "I've seen flight attendants handle much more challenging situations with kindness and respect," she said firmly. "But this was inexcusable." Madison's face flushed with embarrassment. She knew she couldn't defend herself any longer. The truth had been laid bare for everyone to see. The bias she had acted upon, the assumptions she had made based on Jaylen's age and race, could no longer be ignored. The shame of it hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable, as Madison stood frozen, realizing that the passengers around her were no longer willing to tolerate the kind of behavior she had displayed. Jaylen watched all of this unfold with a mixture of disbelief and awe. It was hard to believe that this was his flight, the flight he had been so excited about, the one he had imagined for years, and yet, in the midst of all the chaos, something beautiful had emerged, a moment of collective courage, of unity in the face of injustice. The passengers had become his allies, and together They had turned the tide. Madison's realization was slow, but it was inevitable. The shame that had clouded her face was now a permanent fixture. The power that had once been solely in her hands had shifted, and with it came the undeniable truth. Her actions had consequences. The faces of the passengers, each one who had spoken out, each one who had stood in solidarity, spoke volumes. They were no longer afraid to stand up for what was right, and Jaylen, though a child, had become the unlikeliest but most powerful catalyst for that change. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin began to subside, replaced by a quiet sense of resolve. The collective support of the passengers, the unity they had shown, remained in the air like a force field. Jaylen may have been the one at the center of it all, but it was the passengers who had given him the strength to rise. And in that moment, Jaylen knew that his journey had only just begun. The sky was still wide open for him, full of endless possibilities. And now, he knew he didn't have to fight alone. The flight had finally touched down, and the passengers began to disembark. The once tense atmosphere in the cabin now filled with the sound of rolling luggage and soft chatter. But Jaylen remained seated, his gaze fixed on the tray table in front of him, his fingers nervously tapping the edge. The air was thick with an unspoken tension. It wasn't over yet, not for him. As the last of the passengers filed off the plane, Jaylen stood slowly, adjusting his backpack and gathering his things. He wanted to hurry, to get off the plane and find his father, but before he could move, he felt a presence beside him. Madison was standing there, her posture stiff, but her eyes soft with something new: regret. She hesitated for a moment, clearly struggling with the weight of the situation. Jaylen looked up at her, not angry, but still shaken by everything that had happened. He could see it in her face. She wasn't the same person she had been when he first boarded the flight. The defiance, the coldness, had melted away. "Jaylen," she began, her voice unsteady. I owe you an apology." Jaylen didn't respond immediately, his heart still heavy with the remnants of the emotional roller coaster he'd experienced over the past few hours. He had been mistreated, humiliated in front of a cabin full of strangers, and it wasn't something that could be forgotten easily. But as he looked at Madison, he could see the sincerity in her eyes. She wasn't just offering a surface-level apology to move past it. There was something deeper, something genuine. "I was wrong," Madison continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should never have treated you the way I did. I let my frustration and my assumptions get the best of me, and that was unforgivable. I should have recognized you for who you are and not let my bias cloud my judgment." Jaylen stood there for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He didn't expect her to apologize, at least not so earnestly. She had shown him no respect, no compassion, and yet here she was, acknowledging the hurt she had caused. He had every right to feel angry, to let her words fall on deaf ears, but something inside him pushed him to respond with grace. His father had always taught him to lead with kindness, even when it was difficult. "It's okay," Jaylen said softly, his voice steady despite the rawness he still felt inside. "I understand, but it doesn't change how I felt." Madison nodded, her eyes brimming with a mixture of guilt and relief. "I can't change what I did, but I'm so sorry, truly." Jaylen nodded slowly, accepting the apology, though the emotional scars of the incident lingered in his chest. He didn't know if he'd ever truly forget the sting of her words and the sharpness of her actions, but he understood that sometimes people learned their lessons the hard way. With a final, quiet nod, Madison turned and walked away, leaving Jaylen to process everything in his own time. The weight of the apology, sincere as it was, couldn't erase the emotional turbulence he had gone through. But in that moment, Jaylen understood something crucial. Sometimes even the hardest moments can lead to growth, both for the one who is wronged and for the one who does the wrong. And as he finally walked off the plane, he felt a quiet strength in himself that he hadn't known before. The cabin had emptied, and the last of the passengers disembarked, leaving Jaylen alone with his thoughts. As he made his way down the jet bridge toward the terminal, his heart still carried the weight of everything that had transpired. The flight, which he had once looked forward to with excitement, had turned into something completely unexpected, an emotional roller coaster that had shaken him to his core. He had been mistreated, humiliated in front of a plane full of strangers, and forced to confront the harsh realities of the world around him. Yet, as he walked through the airport, his steps lighter than he expected, something inside him shifted. He realized that despite the discomfort, despite the hurt, this experience had changed him. It had forced him to grow in ways he hadn't anticipated. He thought about how his emotions had shifted throughout the flight, how confusion and hurt had given way to a quiet sense of empowerment. At first, Jaylen had felt small, isolated, and insignificant, as though he were just another unaccompanied minor, overlooked and dismissed by the people around him. But now, as he walked through the terminal, he could feel a newfound confidence. He had faced adversity, and not only had he survived it, he had emerged stronger with a deeper understanding of the world around him. Jaylen had learned the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it seemed like no one was on your side. His father's announcement, though initially shocking, had been the catalyst for change. It had sparked a shift not just within Jaylen, but in the entire cabin. The passengers, once passive, had rallied together in support of him. The power of solidarity, of people coming together to right a wrong, had made all the difference. Jaylen understood now that kindness, empathy, and compassion had the power to overcome even the deepest prejudices. But perhaps the most important lesson he had learned wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about understanding that racial discrimination was a reality. He had witnessed it firsthand. The way Madison had treated him, the assumptions she had made based on his age and the color of his skin. It had been painful. But Jaylen had also learned that the power of empathy could break down barriers. He had seen it in the way the passengers had stood by him, in the way they had rallied together to support him when they saw injustice happening right before their eyes. That support, that shared compassion, had helped him realize that even in the face of prejudice, there was a way forward. As he walked, he carried with him the lessons of the flight, lessons about courage, about the strength that came from being surrounded by allies, and about the importance of always choosing kindness, even in the most difficult moments. He wasn't just a passenger on a plane anymore. He was someone who had faced adversity and come out the other side with a newfound sense of confidence, empathy, and understanding. Jaylen knew this wouldn't be the last time he would encounter challenges in life, but now he was ready to face them head-on, knowing that kindness and solidarity would always be his guiding principles. Captain Michael Roberts stood in the cockpit, preparing for the next leg of the flight. The passengers had disembarked and the crew was going through their final checks before taking off again. But Michael's mind wasn't on the details of the flight. His thoughts were on his son, Jaylen. He had seen the entire exchange unfold from the cockpit, his heart swelling with pride as he watched his son handle the situation with maturity and grace. Michael had always known that Jaylen was special, that he had the potential to do great things, but watching him navigate the challenges of the flight, dealing with the mistreatment and the emotional toll it had taken, had left Michael in awe. Jaylen had faced adversity head-on, standing up for what was right and finding strength in the support of those around him. And Michael couldn't have been prouder. As a father, Michael had always tried to teach Jaylen the importance of kindness, respect, and empathy. He had worked hard to instill in him the belief that no one was better than anyone else, no matter their background or circumstances. But seeing Jaylen live those values in the face of such prejudice, watching him rise above the hurt and find strength in the unity of others, was something Michael would never forget. Later that evening, when the two of them were sitting together at a small cafe near the airport, Michael looked at Jaylen with a mixture of pride and admiration. "You handled yourself so well today, son," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." Jaylen looked up at his father, a quiet smile playing on his lips. He had been through so much that day, emotions ranging from confusion and hurt to empowerment and growth. But there was one thing that stood out above all else: his father's pride. It filled him with warmth, like a beacon guiding him through the storm. "Thanks, Dad," Jaylen replied, his voice steady but full of sincerity. "I didn't expect it to be like that. I thought this would be a normal flight, but I learned a lot today about standing up for what's right, about being strong even when it's hard." Michael nodded, his eyes softening with understanding. It's not easy to stand up for yourself, especially when the world around you doesn't seem to care. But you've shown me today that you're more than capable. You've got a strength inside you that I've always known was there. And don't ever forget this, son. No matter what you face in life, as long as you stay true to your values, as long as you lead with kindness and respect, you can accomplish anything. Jaylen met his father's gaze, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I won't forget, Dad. I know what you've always taught me. Kindness and respect, those are the things that matter most." Michael smiled, a deep sense of pride filling his chest. "I'm proud of the man you're becoming, and I know one day you'll be up there, in the cockpit, just like me. But remember, being a pilot isn't just about flying a plane. It's about leading with heart, taking care of those around you, and making sure everyone feels safe and valued. You've already got that inside you, Jaylen." The two of them sat in companionable silence, the weight of the day settling between them. But in that silence, there was a sense of understanding, a recognition of the journey they had both been on. It wasn't just about a flight. It was about the lessons learned, the growth achieved, and the bond they shared as father and son. As they walked together toward the gate for the next flight, Jaylen felt a quiet sense of peace. He knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them, and with his father by his side, there was nothing he couldn't handle. In that moment, as they stood side by side, Jaylen knew that his journey was just beginning. The sky was vast, and his future was limitless. And as long as he held on to the values of kindness, respect, and empathy, there was nothing he couldn't achieve. Have you ever witnessed or experienced racial discrimination? How did you respond? What actions did you take, and what impact did it have on those around you? Share your story in the comments below. Let's talk about how we can all work together to create change. Every voice matters, and together, we can make a real difference. The story of Jaylen and the passengers aboard that flight is a story that transcends the ordinary. It is not just about a child being mistreated. It is about the power of resilience, unity, and the strength of human connection in the face of adversity. In the world we live in, racial discrimination is not a rarity. It is a reality that far too many people have to face every day. But what this story illustrates so beautifully is that when we come together, when we refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice, we can create lasting change. Jaylen was just a child, but he showed us something incredible. Despite the mistreatment he faced, despite the unfairness and prejudice that weighed heavily on him, he didn't back down. His strength wasn't in his size or his age, it was in his courage to remain true to who he was, to stand tall even when everything seemed to be stacked against him. And while it is easy to feel alone when facing such challenges, Jaylen's story teaches us that we don't have to fight these battles alone. The passengers who supported him, the people who chose to speak up, showed us the importance of solidarity. When we unite, when we decide that we will no longer allow others to suffer in silence, we can begin to dismantle the systems of inequality that persist in our society. The power of resilience is not just about enduring, it's about using our voices, our actions, and our support to create a world where injustice cannot thrive. Every time we choose to speak out, every time we stand up for what's right, we are building the foundation for change. We have the power to make a difference, just like the passengers did for Jaylen. The ripple effect of their collective action was undeniable. They didn't just witness injustice, they acted. They understood that they could not stand by while someone was being wronged. They showed us that each small act of kindness, each act of empathy, has the power to ignite something bigger. And while Jaylen's journey was filled with discomfort, confusion, and pain, it was also filled with growth. It was a journey that brought him closer to understanding the realities of the world, but also closer to the truth of who he was. He didn't let prejudice define him. Instead, he rose above it. And in doing so, he showed us the power of courage. The courage to be yourself, to stand up for others, and to never give in to the forces that seek to diminish. But the story doesn't end with Jaylen. It doesn't end with the passengers who spoke out on his behalf. It continues with all of us. Each of us has the capacity to make a difference. We can be the ones who choose to speak up, to support those who are marginalized, and to challenge the systems that perpetuate discrimination. Change begins with us. Each one of us has a role to play in building a more compassionate, equitable world. When we come together as a community, when we choose to empathize and support one another, we become a powerful force for good. No matter how small an act may seem, no matter how insignificant it might feel in the moment, every act of kindness, every act of support, every moment of standing up for what's right counts. We are stronger when we are united, and in a world where racial discrimination continues to affect so many lives, it is our collective responsibility to fight against it. The strength of community lies in our ability to confront challenges together, to lift each other up when the weight of the world feels too heavy. We don't have to face these battles alone. Jaylen's story is a reminder that we are all capable of more than we think. We are all capable of change, of growth, and of making a difference. If we can hold on to the values of empathy, respect, and kindness, we can create a world where everyone's dignity is recognized and respected. We can create a world where no one has to endure the pain of discrimination alone. So let's make a pact together. Let's choose to stand up for what's right. Let's choose to support each other, to speak out when we see injustice, and to always act with empathy. Because in the end, the world we create depends on the actions we take today. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for being a part of this journey. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage, change, and the power of resilience. Together, we can create a world where everyone's dignity is recognized and respected. Let's stand together and keep fighting for change. We're in this together.